So we've already spoken about how metacognition is so important for developing all of these different skills. It seems to be the way that you can solve so many different problems in one go. And when I've taught this to educators in the past, some of the messages that I've gotten was that it only adds more work to an already full plate. And I completely understand where that's coming from. Teachers are not only busy, but it can also be very frustrating to try and fix more and more of these problems. I've talked about this before. The reason that I'm such a proponent and an advocate for training metacognition and embedding that as part of your practice is because that is the only path forward where over time your job gets easier, because the student is going to be able to pull more of that weight themselves. And at first, yes, it does require some work, but it's not requiring more or additional work than what you're already doing. If a student comes to you with a question, you're already having to spend time to answer that question anyway. If a student is concerned with something or they're struggling with their critical thinking, you're already putting in that effort. And in fact, it's much more frustrating to constantly see the student struggling, not being able to engage in the right type of thinking, or feeling like you have to pull them along and everything depends on you as the teacher. And the only way to eliminate that is to bring the student into that process much more deeply and give them the tools so that they can continue and drive their own journey. And that's the reason why metacognition is so powerful. So it's actually just replacing the way that you communicate with your student now, rather than adding more things for you to do. Instead of doing it this way, which you may be used to doing, instead we can do it a different way. And over time, that lightens your load while also improving the short-term and long-term outcomes of the student. Another sentiment that I've sometimes heard is that training metacognition, this is only relevant for those students that are already high achievers. For the students that are just struggling, they're not able to even do the most basic of learning tasks, they are struggling to even just pass. Metacognition is something that is too advanced for them. It's only for the students that are already doing quite well, and those aren't the students you're worried about anyway. And to this, I'd say that is completely mistaken. Metacognition is beneficial for all types of students. However, if you think about the student that is already performing quite highly, they can gain more control over their process. They're able to do well already with a certain process, and by understanding that process more deeply, they can do it even better, more efficiently, with less time, with less stress, more transferably across subjects. The better students are getting even better. The students that aren't able to even pass, these students will lack insight into a whole host of other issues. And so for them to try to get better and to overcome that is an almost insurmountable hill. We all have worked with students that we have put in so much time and so much effort, maybe across multiple years, and we have found that the students simply just not grow and develop and learn like other students do. And it's not because they have a learning disability, it's just that they don't seem to get it. But when we say they don't get it, what is the it that they don't get? In a lot of cases, they are not aware of where they are going wrong. They do not have what we call insight into the process and insight into where they're making the mistakes. And so one of the most powerful things that they can do is to develop that insight. So, for example, a student that's achieving very highly, already getting 90%, they're not going to become 50% better, because for them, they're already at 90%. Whereas for that student that's here, they might not get 50% better because of the fact that they're starting from such a low baseline. However, for both types of students, and for all students, they can all get relative improvements. And these improvements stack over time. As you learn more about your processes, you now have more information to work with, and it's easier to explore and learn even more. And so over time, these students become more and more competent and able. And seeing that journey is also a much more motivating experience from the teacher's perspective as well. Now, at the beginning of this video, I talked about how we are replacing the way that we are interacting with our student with other forms of interaction. That's not going to add more work. And previously, I've given you some techniques but it's been a high-level discussion, really understanding the perspective, the priorities, and the rationale. For some of you, it may have seemed a little abstract still. And so in this particular video, I want to give you some very concrete evidence-based suggestions in terms of strategies and communication techniques that you can use in your classroom every single day that will help with metacognition. And you'll see that all of these are very easy to do. Now, I'm going to give you a number of different strategies. However, I want you to observe what is the same across all of them, the tendency, the trend between all of these techniques, which is that every single technique puts the ownership of the problem in the learner's hands. What we're trying to do here is engage the learner into thinking, owning the problem, and trying to solve it themselves. So we as the teacher, we are not trying to solve the problem. We are trying to observe how our student solves the problem. And this is something that's called second order observership. And it's fundamental to teaching, coaching, and mentoring. It is the idea that we are not worried with the problem in itself. That would be first order observership. The student is the one who is undergoing first order observership. They're seeing a problem, they have a question, and they're thinking about a topic. The second order observer is seeing the person observing the first order. What we're interested in is, how is the student thinking about solving the problem? What approach are they using to figure out how to solve the problem? If they don't know which equation or formula to use in a subject like maths, we're not interested in seeing what formula are they using. We're interested in how are they thinking about the problem to decide which formula to use. You can see it's a step before that. If it's a subject like English, where we're trying to read a text or a book and write an essay about it, we're not interested at that moment in the class about what points are they writing. We're interested in how are they thinking about the text and how are they approaching the transformation of that into the essay. We're thinking about the process that they're undergoing. And so all the questions that we ask are going to be based around investigating that process. And this works for every single subject. And now here is where things might get challenging. For even the most experienced teacher, in order for any of these techniques to work, you have to let the student struggle. The student must find a certain level of difficulty. So when I introduce these techniques, it's important to think about how much are we going to let the student struggle. So let me start with the first one. The first one is very, very simple. It is simply to explain our thought process. Often, teachers are seen as a source of information. They have knowledge that is transferred down. But as we have already discussed, the most valuable thing that you can do is not transfer knowledge. Let's be honest. You don't know as much as the textbook. You don't know as much as 20 textbooks. You don't know more than Google itself knows. You will never be in a position where your knowledge is your strength. What your strength is your ability to guide another person's ability to navigate this knowledge and navigate the thought processes. So what is most valuable for them is not simply what, but how you are thinking about the subject. So think about that next time you do a lesson plan, whether you're explaining a concept, whether you're explaining a certain grade or an assessment, whether you're going through a practice question and your thought processes. Make sure that you're giving a rationale behind how you are thinking about each of these steps. Don't simply say, this is what you need to know, this is how you apply it. Add the step in the middle, saying, here's the knowledge and information that we have. Here's a problem that we have, or an application of how we can use this. And here is how I'm thinking about it. And it could be, for example, I see a problem here, I see a question, and when I read this, the first thing I'm thinking about is this, this, or this. And I'm wondering to myself, could it be that I could use this, or could it be that I use this? And so you can see how now we're opening the box in terms of how we're thinking. That mysterious expertise is no longer mysterious. The student is learning from your approach more so than just memorizing how you answered that single question, which we as teachers all know is very frustrating. And that does not prepare them for the questions that they're actually going to get in an examination anyway, especially the trickier questions that separate the top students from the rest. On top of this, we can add in another technique, which is to add dedicated self-reflection time at the end of every topic, or after a test, or after a pre-test, whenever you feel like the student has undergone a meaningful, decent learning experience. And for some people, that could be a single class or a single lecture. For some people, that may be at the end of a week. It could be after a specific test, after a specific topic. It's going to be up to you. You know the dynamics of your topic and the dynamics of your class better than I'm going to know it. So I'll leave that decision up to you. But having some kind of regular self-reflection as part of your teaching process is beneficial for two reasons. The first one is obvious. When we have dedicated self-reflection, we are giving the students a chance to reflect and use their reflections to create an experiment, all of those things that we talked about before, and we're giving ourselves an opportunity to facilitate that and engage that process. It's very difficult to facilitate reflective, experimental practice in a student when you never have the opportunity to reflect and experiment. And so we're giving ourselves and our students an opportunity to engage in that. The second benefit is less obvious, but actually this could potentially be even more powerful. When we as a teacher and in a classroom setting, especially over a long period of time, make the idea of self-reflection a norm, it trains our students to start thinking reflectively in the first place. The idea that self-reflection is not something that just naturally happens as you live around your daily life, and that dedicated time to deliberately self-reflect can be valuable, that concept is something that a lot of people never really pick up until they're far into their adulthood. And in fact, some people never pick up that skill. There is this implicit understanding in society, for whatever reason, that we should be able to self-reflect and identify our mistakes and issues just automatically. When we do something and we make a mistake, we should be able to just learn from that mistake. But actually, that's not the case. We don't always learn from every mistake. That's why you can make the same mistake twice. And even if you do learn from a mistake, the amount you learn and the value you extract from that experience differs significantly depending on the quality of that person's reflection. And so unless we're happy to say every student will just extract a different amount of value if they just happen to be better at reflecting than another student, we should actually be training our students in the reflective process so that all of our students are able to extract maximum value from every experience. And so when this is combined, you'll see that the student will start doing some self-reflections even when it's not in those scheduled areas. You'll see them do it in subjects where you're not their teacher, and you'll see them reap the benefits of that and become more intrinsically motivated in the learning process. Again, this is all a sign that that metacognition is growing. A really useful activity to do during these self-reflection sessions, and it could be a separate session, or it could be at the second half of the same session. It's completely up to you and the capability of your students. If you have younger students, trying to do both of these in a single session might be a little bit difficult. If your students are a little bit more advanced, a bit more mature, maybe they can manage this. But it is to set learning goals. Now, I have a big issue with the way that most people set learning goals. Most people set learning goals using something that is completely arbitrary. I want to get a certain mark in a test. I want to study a certain number of chapters. I want to study a certain number of hours, or finish a certain number of practice questions, or do a certain number of pages, or write a certain amount of notes. These are the ways that many people will schedule their time and set their learning goals. This is completely meaningless. The number of pages that you cover, the number of notes that you write, the number of questions that you do, these don't really matter. Sure, if you're not writing any notes, if you're not doing any practice, if you're not spending any time studying, doing some study and writing some notes and doing some questions, this will all help, definitely. But if they're already doing this, is the answer simply to do more? Probably not. In that case, why do you have some students that do the same amount of practice and hours of studying as another student, but they don't do as well? Or maybe they've even done more, but they still don't do as well. The key is that what happens in here with our thinking is the most important part of the learning process. And so our goals should reflect that. And so what we'll do is in the description, you'll see that there is a link to an example of learning goals that are done correctly. We'll give you a few different examples on what types of learning goals are more beneficial. And I want you to observe how they're very process oriented. And the idea is that when you get the process as good as it can be, the outcome, the grade, the test score, naturally, as a symptom of that process, will become better. And a lot of us as adults, we already know that. But our students, they often do not. Our students often have never thought about being process driven rather than outcome driven. And when they're only thinking about the outcome, the score, then they're not able to actually succeed. They're going to be paralyzed in that pressure. I've had students that have said to me that they're not able to focus on doing their practice questions because there's so much pressure for them to achieve 100%, that the only thing that they can think about when they're doing the question is 100. It's just going through their mind constantly. They are paralyzed by the fear of failure because all they care about is 100, 100, 100, 100. And that is creating a lot of anxiety. And so we don't want our students to be in that kind of mindset. And one of those very powerful framing exercises we can do is right at the beginning when we set our goals, we say, sure, it's great that you want to achieve 100 or 98 or a great result in the test score. We're not saying don't do that. What we're saying is, what can we do to make sure you have the best chance of that happening as possible? And that is about creating process-driven goals that build our metacognition and our ability to adjust and fine-tune our plan as necessary. So make sure to check out that resource in the links. Now, the next one is about how you can interact with your students on a daily basis whenever they come to you asking questions or there's anything that they might be uncertain about. And there's two parts to this: prompt and reinforcement. When someone asks us a question, the response that we give should prompt them to think metacognitively about their thinking process. And when they engage in that behavior, we need to reinforce that, congratulate them, say well done about that. So here's a simple example. Let's say a student comes to you from a chemistry class and they don't know how to understand this particular concept. They're not sure about that. So instead of saying, well, what do you understand, and explaining it to them in a way that feels very easy for them to understand, which again, remember, there's great intentions behind that, but that might actually be doing more long-term harm because they didn't have the skills to figure it out themselves. Instead, we can simply prompt with, how are you thinking about this? And you see, that type of question is very different to how many teachers would approach that. How are you thinking about this is different to what are you thinking about? And so students can often be quite confused about this initially. They ask you a question about how to apply something in chemistry, and you respond by saying, well, how are you thinking about this? And then they will say, well, what I think is this, and this, and this. But that's not what you asked. What you asked was, how are you thinking about it? So what process are they using to try and figure this out? And you see, now that is about the learning process. They didn't understand that. So are you trying to, did you look through other resources? When you look through those other resources, what did you think about? How did you think about it? How did you try to fill that gap? How did you try to identify where the gap was? You see, when you ask questions like this, students start to realize that often they have no idea how they are going about learning. They don't have that insight. They don't have that metacognition. And by prompting them like this, we can make them start thinking about it. And when we give them some guidance to think this way, they then start to solve the problem themselves. And next time, they don't need to ask you that question because now they have the tools to problem solve it themselves. And so what we're doing here is we're teaching the students that don't know how to self-regulate We're giving them the skills to self-regulate, to become more like those golden students that we love to work with who have a problem and they simply just go away and they figure it out themselves. And the questions that they ask you are often very different. They're often much more nuanced. They really require an expert level discussion. But let's bring it back to reality. Most students, when you ask them this question of how are you thinking about something, they have no idea. They can't even begin to answer you. And that's fine, because that's the beginning of the journey. Focus on what they are able to observe. Start by asking questions like, tell me about how you've gone about studying this so far. What have you done with the information? And how have you tried to understand that? Start with that. Most students can answer that to some degree. When you notice that they're thinking about their thinking process, congratulate them on it. You can say things like, oh, you mentioned that you were taking something and you were trying to summarize it. That's a great observation. It's a good thing that you've noticed that you've done that. When you did that, did it become easier? Did it become harder? Did you struggle with that? Were there some pieces of information you found it difficult to summarize? When you found it difficult, how did you try to overcome that? The discussion is completely different from what we normally engage our students with. It's not about the content or the topic anymore. Well, it's not yet. There is a right time where we bring our content knowledge directly help the student, but it's not yet. Because remember, we want the student to struggle a little bit. We want to prompt them and probe them with these types of metacognitive questions so you can see that they're really thinking about this. They're thinking, how am I studying? How am I learning this right now? Where is the difficulty? Why do I have the difficulty? When I have the difficulty, what am I trying to do with this? At a certain point, you'll see that the student really just has no idea and the questions you're asking them aren't getting anywhere anymore. For some students, you can do this type of questioning for a long time. And by the end of it, they think, oh, I might be able to try this. And you say, great, try that, see how it works, and then come back to me. Let me know if you still have that same issue or if you were able to figure out that problem by yourself. And that's the best case scenario. They come with you with the problem and you leave never having answered the problem. That's perfect because you have equipped them with the skills to think about it, have an idea, and then experiment and then come back to you. And you're reinforcing that that is a good thing. That's perfect. And it's actually a lot more time efficient than just explaining it straight off the bat. Because if you do that, you're just going to be explaining for the rest of your life. Some students, you'll say, how are you thinking about this? And after maybe just 1 or 2 questions, they have nothing more to give. And at that point, you can start giving them some clues. Have you tried thinking about it from this perspective instead? Have you looked at it from this particular angle? Have you looked at this particular resource? You can ask them questions like, well, if you try to take this concept and then this concept, and you try to compare them against each other, what do you think you might realize? And they would say, well, I have no idea. And then you'd say, great, I want you to try that and let me know how you found it. So in this situation, the student wasn't the one that came up with the idea for the experiment. You were the one that gave them the suggestion. And that suggestion should be around that higher order thinking, higher order learning. We want them to compare, evaluate ideas together. We want to get them used to more critical, evaluative thinking. So we say, why don't you give this a go? Try to take a few of these ideas and try to see what the similarities and differences are between them. And see if you can find any trends or patterns that help you answer your question. And it's okay if you don't, but I want you to give it a go. Spend about 15, 20 minutes trying that, and then let's talk about it again next lesson. And then after that, they may come back and they'd say, hey, I discovered something. That's great. Or they come back and they say, I still didn't get it. And at that point, you can explain it to them. You can do what you'd normally do and try to explain it to them. But by layering it in this way, where explaining it to them is really the last resort, we're giving them many opportunities to engage with self-regulation, higher order learning, and develop that metacognition. And the entire time, you are reinforcing that that is a good thing to be doing. That is a great behavior to be engaging in. And so students will start having a sense of pride about the fact that they had a problem and they figured it out themselves. They'll start coming to you and saying, hey teacher, I had this problem, but I tried thinking about it like this, and this is what I think now. Am I right or am I wrong? And when you can say, yes, That's a great observation. I love how you found that this is what you did, what you could do, and then you gave an experiment and then you found that. That's great. And the conclusion you got to is almost correct, but there's an additional little detail here. Let me give you a hint. Have you thought about this thing? And they'd say, oh, okay. And then they go away and try it again. So that dynamic completely changes. For many teachers, this type of dynamic is a dream. But you can't get that type of dynamic without structuring the way that we're communicating with our students to eventually get to that level. And again, some students will really struggle with this. So you have to just bring it to whatever level that they are on. You want them to struggle, not too much, but not too little. So for each student, you have to cater that a little bit. But again, it's much more sustainable, especially long-term, than just simply trying to be the best at explaining a concept simply. Now, the final point is just a small detail in terms of how we ask our questions. I've mentioned this before, but we want to start with open questions and then getting to more closed or leading questions. And the reason is because open questions makes the students think more and think more deeply. We want them to generate this learning. We don't want to ask them a question straight away where the answer seems obvious or it feels like you're being led to the answer. For example, they may have come to you with a problem, and if your first question is not open, but instead it's, have you considered comparing and evaluating this concept with this concept? And you already know that they probably haven't, and then they're thinking, no, I haven't, and it seems like that's what you want me to do, so I guess I'll go do that. See, now they didn't have to think about their own thinking process much at all. They didn't have to find their own gaps. And so that's, again, an opportunity for them to train that skill that's been removed. So we start with these open questions. If they really struggle, then you can bring it down a little bit, make it a little bit more specific. And if they really struggle, you can make it a little bit more specific, and you can keep doing this. And then for the really beginner students that really struggle with this, you still start with the open ones, still challenge them. However, you'd end up with a question that is very leading, that's just very direct. But then over time, you can try to widen that out and challenge and push that a little bit more. As a reference point, students that are really struggling, you might have to do this very low level approach where you're giving a lot to them for around 4 to 6 months before you start seeing that they're really opening up a lot more. Whereas obviously for your advanced students that have more metacognition to begin with, or they have better deep processing skills and they can think about this more easily, then you can start with the open ones, and you can probably keep it very open for after just a couple of weeks of trying to do this. So you'll see the differences come through. But the idea is that for wherever the student is at a baseline, we're just bringing them up one step at a time, starting from wherever they are, meeting them at their level, and then taking them to the next step, and the next step, and the next step. Again, we will summarize all of the main points here, all the specifics and guidelines. We'll put them in a PDF. So check out the description and have a look at that link.